we might get things started then. So hello everybody, welcome to our conversation today. We're here for International Women's Day, which was actually on Monday. And we're here with Nic to discuss the topic of challenging fat phobia. So I've got a little bit of housekeeping to start with, and then we'll kind of get things underway. So basically this is live, obviously, but we are also recording it. We'll add captions and then upload it on YouTube and on our website. We'll also save a copy to IGTV. So if you can't stay the whole time, or if someone couldn't make it today, they'll still be able to watch later on. So for those who don't know me already, I'm Rowie. I'm the Health Promotions and Practice Coordinator at Eating Disorders Queensland. In case you're not familiar with EDQ and you're just here for Nic, that's okay. So we're based in Brisbane. We look after all of Queensland, and we provide community-based counselling and support services for both people living with eating disorders and for their loved ones and carers. So thank you to Queensland Health for giving us the funding that you give us to put on awareness and education events like this, and also to provide the majority of our services. And so before we get things too into it, I do want to pay my acknowledgements to the Yagara and Turrbal people, who are the traditional owners of the land I'm on today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and we acknowledge that this land was never ceded, and that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have experienced and still experience to this day ongoing trauma related to this land.
I would also like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is the land that I'm on today, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging.
Thanks, Nic. So as I mentioned, I'm here at the EDQ office, which is in Brisbane, and joining us today is the very lovely Nic McDermid, who is in Sydney. So to introduce Nic, Nic is a writer, a disruptor and a fat activist, and she's joining us here today to share her lived experience and knowledge. So thank you very much, Nic, and a very big welcome from all of EDQ.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to partner with EDQ. It's been a dream of mine, actually, to partner with you. You've always been such huge supporters of my work, so glad we could collaborate on this International Women's Day event.
Yes, it's a bit of a dream partnership for us all, I think. So a little bit of background for people. International Women's Day is an annual event, and as I said, it was this past Monday. It's a day to celebrate women, but also to use collective action to bring highlights some inequalities that we still face, and to move towards a more just world. So this year's topic was Choose to Challenge, and we've decided to focus on a theme that is directly relevant to women and the work we do each day at EDQ, which is fat phobia. So Nic immediately came to our mind as someone who is really at the front of the game in challenging fat phobia. So Nic, if you wouldn't mind, can you give us a little bit of an overview of your background and your expertise?
Sure. So for those who may not know me, I'm Nic. I have been fairly active in the activism space, fat activism space, for the last couple of years. I'm really an advocate, an activist, an intersectional feminist, and a full-time unapologetic fat person. I have a lived experience of an eating disorder, and particularly a lived experience of an eating disorder in a marginalised body. And that, I guess, my experience through my eating disorder as well as through recovery has taught me a lot, and I've experienced a lot, and it's kind of really led me on this path to wanting to fight for, as Rowie said, a more just world, and a world where we can really start to disrupt more and more, particularly with fat phobia. It's something that is so enmeshed into our landscape that you know, it's everybody's responsibility to work towards fighting that and to breaking down those societal structures.
Definitely everybody's to fight. Something you mentioned this morning that I was thinking about was that it is unfortunately quite rare for a person with lived experience of an eating disorder who is now recovered and in a larger body to be given or to be able to access a platform to speak, which I just think is so unfortunate because it's not rare. It's so many people have recovered and have now found their place in a larger body, and we shouldn't be afraid of that or be hiding that. It's just a fact. So I'm really glad that you explicitly mentioned that, so I could remember to talk about it as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's certainly something that, as a person in a marginalised body, and particularly in a fat body, I guess for myself as well, I also am a person with a chronic illness and a person whose body I'm not so able-bodied at times because of my chronic illness, and also a person with mental health issues as well. So for somebody that occupies, you know, quite a few marginalizations, unless our story kind of fits the mold, so to speak, and that is the kind of dominant narrative around thin, white, able-bodied, conventionally attractive, recovered into, you know, a still socially acceptable body, then everybody else's narratives seem to get lost, and we're quite often denied agency and quite often even denied the vocabulary to talk about our experiences because they are so dominated by this narrative that just keeps on being perpetuated. And so we just don't have a place for our stories, which is really sad.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, there is such a strong narrative and stereotype that still persists. And someone commented to point out that people don't just end up in bigger bodies after recovering. They are throughout, or can be throughout and beforehand, and all of that is just part of their journey. There's no set way of things happening, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. So something I've noticed already and we wanted to talk about today, Nic, was the terminology that we're using. Do you want to cover that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'm a person that uses the word fat to describe my body. It's a word that for so many years was fraught with so much, shame, I guess is the biggest emotion that I can think of at the moment. So I was really ashamed of being a fat person, and I was really ashamed of my own body. And I, you know, through all the messages that I received growing up, I learnt to hate my own body. And so fat was the insult that used to just get right to the core. It used to, I would end up a mess. And, you know, being a fat kid in high school when you've got bullies and people that are just so relentless in their bullying and teasing, it was a horrible experience. And I'm sure so many people can relate to that as well. It took me a long time to get to a place where using the word fat didn't kind of bring up that immediate shame response. And it was such an important part of my recovery. It was such an empowering part of my recovery where I could stand in my body and reclaim a word that just used to completely belittle and dehumanize me. I'm not saying any of that was easy at all. It's not. I guess it's in terms of terminology, fat is a word that a lot of people use because they've worked so hard to reclaim it. But it's not a word that everybody in a bigger body uses. So I know we were going to talk a little bit about, you know, is it okay to use the word fat, or is it okay to, you know, how do we describe people's bodies?
Yeah.
I guess it's a little kind of contentious. There are some people who like myself have reclaimed the word fat, and we prefer people to use the word fat. But I would also say that if you are going up to meet a person for the first time, or you don't know the person, you don't know how they identify, you know, with their body and that sort of thing, probably not a good idea to use the word fat straight off the bat. You know, using a term like people in larger bodies, for instance, and you'll find that if you're using the term people in larger bodies and there are fat people present that prefer the word fat, like, we'll tell you.
Yeah.
You've
got a voice, you'll use them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also gives permission for people to use the word without feeling like they're insulting people as well. Because quite often people have so much of their own internalized fat phobia that even though we've given them permission to use the word fat, it's still a really uncomfortable experience for people because of the connotations that the word fat holds.
Yeah, the history and our own personal memories and connections. Yeah, and as you said, I think there is power for some people in using a word that has been used against them for so long. But it is about respecting everyone's personal journey and choice, and if that's something that someone isn't comfortable with or prefers not to use, then we will follow that lead. But yes, at EDQ we use the word fat. We talk a lot about fat phobia. We do also talk about weight stigma, which is the same thing but with a different name. We'll be using the word fat today, so there's some context to it. So earlier today, well, just before the live stream started, we did share a post, an Instagram post on the stories that came from Fierce Fat Femme is her Instagram handle, and she's a creator from the States. And we really liked it. Nick found it and shared it with EDQ. It's a really, really good resource, a really helpful resource. So it breaks down fat phobia into the 4 I's of oppression, which is a historical framework about oppression. So it breaks down fat phobia into the 4 ways it can be perpetuated and gives some examples. So Nick, do you want to start us off from the top and we can go through them all?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got my phone on a tripod, and then I've got a little list of notes underneath. So if I'm looking down, I'm looking at my notes.
Same with me. I've got my notes next, and that's why I keep looking away. It's so I can use the right words instead of stumbling over them constantly.
I always like to have notes just in case. So as Rowie said, this post came from Fierce Fat Femme, and they had put it out a while ago. I saw it, I saved it, I loved it, because I think it just really encapsulates you know, as Rowie said, the 4 I's of fat phobia, and they're so important at like every level in society. So I guess I'm going to start from kind of the overarching, and I'll drill down. So the overarching is this ideological perspective. So it's this overarching societal preference for thin bodies. And, you know, we see that in, gosh, every aspect of our life, don't we?
Where don't we?
It's exactly. So it's just, it's a moral and ideological preference for bodies that kind of fit the norm. Then we kind of go to institutional, and this is where fat phobia actually shows up for people. So this is, or not for people, for like everywhere. So our society, really, it's our societal structures. So we think about medical, we think about media, we think about employment, we think about accessibility, we think about, gosh, what am I missing?
It's everywhere. It's things like seat belts being a certain length, chairs having arms that are a certain part. It's clothing only going up to a certain point, and if you're beyond that, you have to go to a special store that's online and super expensive. It's everywhere. Medicine, dating,
Yeah.
people who are only friends with people who look just like them. It's everywhere.
Absolutely.
And I do want to point out as well, with all of these 4 levels, it's not always explicit.
Yeah.
It's so built in and so ingrained in everything we do and the way we're raised. It's not one person who just really strongly has decided from their own self that they don't like fat people. It's the whole big picture.
Absolutely. And it's so built into the society in which we live. It's become such a part of our cultural landscape, of our political landscape and our social landscape. It's it's built into like public health campaigns. Like, I'm not even gonna mention the ones that I'm thinking of.
No. You can see it's a sore point for me.
Oh, I know. As Rowie said, it's built into everything, and there's no, I guess, there's no, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess there's no real knowing exactly how to kind of pull it apart or how to detach it from these societal structures, because it is so built in.
Yeah, and that's the ideology of it. It's not like, when you turn 8, someone sits you down and teaches you all about fat people and how awful and unwell they are. It's from birth. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
I read a study recently, and they interviewed a lot of 4 to 6-year-olds, and they were showing them pictures of different people and asking the kids to reflect on what they thought about that person, what they might be like, if they'd want to play with them or be friends with them. And they found really clearly that kids at this age had a really strong dislike for fat people. They thought they were mean and rude and naughty and dirty and messy, and they didn't want to be friends with them. They didn't want to play with them. These are little guys, little 4-year-olds. Just shows how much it's there.
I mean, you have to ask yourself, where does that come from?
Exactly.
Where does that deep-seated disgust and dislike come from? And these little kiddos that are 4 years old, where did they learn that from?
Yeah.
That's what's so sad about it. And I think that kind of lends itself into like the next I, which is interpersonal. And so this comes to like policing and the surveilling of other people's bodies, like unsolicited diet advice, people offering you the next U-Butte keto diet or whatever the heck it is this time around.
This is the one that you see in all the all of the lunch rooms. And you have to justify why you're having or not having the cake for someone's birthday or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is in our interpersonal interactions with people. So this is the teasing and the bullying. This is, This
is whinging when a fat person sits next to you on the bus.
Yeah.
This is the one where you start to really hear it and see it.
Yeah. Yeah. The eye rolling when someone has to get out of their plane seat to let you through. Like,
yeah.
I detest flying for that reason. And I guess the last one is intrapersonal. So the one before was interpersonal. This one is intrapersonal. So this is more internalized fat phobia. This is our own beliefs around our bodies, our own beliefs about fat people. Yeah.
This is the one where you're afraid of gaining weight.
Yeah.
Or you calculate what you're eating and what you might need to do because of what you're eating. This is feeling ashamed or like a failure if you've gained weight. It's new mums feeling like they need to lose weight and get back to exercise. yeah, it's this ongoing fear of gaining weight and becoming a fat person.
Yeah, so often people have, I guess their worst nightmare is one day looking like I do, or one day looking like, you know, another fat person who is fatter than I am. You know, it's, yeah, and it's so hard in a world that keeps telling you that fat bodies are wrong. And you're trying to claim space and justify your humanity, and you've got people that are so afraid of looking like you, and it just upholds the ideological view that we were talking about before, in terms of, you know, this preference for a thinner body and a slimmer body.
Yeah, and it's not, we're not accusing people of having a conscious bias or fat people, and that's why it's ingrained, it's societal, it's because of all these other eyes that it leads to it. It's not an intentional choice. It's a societal issue. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you have to question, as I said before, like, where do people learn this from, and, you know, what behavior is modeled, you know, and we're just getting pummeled by so many aspects of society that tell us that fat bodies are morally inferior. And I mean, it's any wonder that people end up being so afraid of being fat. Yeah, and there's stuff as well, like when people say they're feeling fat today, but they're actually using it as a shortcut for another negative emotion that they maybe haven't connected yet. And just that kind of thing that just builds up every day in so many directions. Yeah. And I think that that's something that, particularly for myself in eating disorder treatment, it was something that wasn't picked up on in eating disorder treatment. Like, these conversations were allowed to continue and allowed to keep going. Like, they weren't shut down, or they weren't sorry, that shutting down a conversation sounds really horrible, but they I guess they weren't challenged. And so it was left unchecked, and the microaggressions in that sense just kind of kept on going. So, you know, when a person says, I feel fat, I really challenge people to really kind of get in touch. Like, is it an uncomfortable feeling? Like, what is it about feeling fat? Is it uncomfortable? Is it shame? Is it anger? Is it, you know, what else is going on in here inside that, you know, is making you feel discomfort somewhere in your body? Yeah.
And I think you've touched on something there, Nic, which we should talk about, which is the eating disorder sector, and in a bigger way, medicine is an area where, unfortunately, there is so much fat phobia and weight stigma, and there's so much work to be done, and it really is allowed to perpetuate, but also reinforced by a lot of medical professionals.
Yeah,
and we're going to come back later towards the end, circle back and talk about how we can specifically challenge that a little bit more. So I guess to summarize what we've done so far is we've just gone through what fat phobia is and ways we can see it. And now, if we want to really get to the meat of things, how do we challenge it, Nic? What can we do?
Gosh, this live stream could go on forever. I
know. I'm the timekeeper, and I'm like, oh.
I know. I'm just on a strict schedule. Look, I think it comes down to recognizing that challenging fat phobia is everybody's business. I mean, fat phobia obviously disproportionately affects those who are fat, but it doesn't discriminate in the fact that everybody is affected. So in the way that everybody is affected by fat phobia, it's also everybody's responsibility to challenge it. And so, look, I'm probably a little bit gung-ho in the way that I challenge things. I'm a little bit kind of outspoken and, you know, quite direct in the way that I challenge fat phobia, but that's just me. We can challenge it in being able to question our medical professionals when they're talking to us about something that we didn't consent to. You know, I'm thinking of all the times you go to the doctor for a common cold and you leave with weight loss advice. Yes. Being able to challenge it, you know, in that sense. Being able to, you know, go out to dinner with your fat friends and, you know, not sit in a booth seat, for instance. Being able to notice where accessibility issues might be of a concern. If you see a public health campaign that is extremely damaging, write to whoever it is that you need to write to. You know, be able to, you know, push back, you know, be able to kind of push back on things that you see on social media feeds. Curate your social media feeds so you're following people in diverse bodies with diverse experiences. Gosh. Yeah, I guess being able to pull up your friends and your family too when they're, you know, when they might be saying something that is quite fat phobic. It's not an easy thing to do, to challenge fat phobia, and it can put people in a lot of positions where they feel quite intimidated. But it's when you think of the discomfort that fat people actually feel when fat phobia is directed at them, and the moment of discomfort that you might feel in challenging fat phobia, like, yeah, you've got to kind of weigh that up. But yeah, I've gone blank on the challenging. Are there more that you want to add?
No, we'll come back to it. I think it is. Yeah, it's a really important note that it does impact everybody, and it's not just the responsibility of people who have personally experienced fat phobia, or not just the responsibility of fat people. You know, I'm in a straight-sized body, as the fashion industry would call it, and I've experienced fat phobia. We all have, in a number of ways. And yeah, it's on all of us to challenge that when we can and where we have the capacity to. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about your experience, Nic. I know with your lived experience of an eating disorder, that was really hard for you with fat phobia coming into play, and we know that people in bigger bodies take a longer time to get diagnosed, experience different treatment that is often less effective, and that kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit more about your experience with that, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure. I guess before I jump into that, I have to preface this with, whilst I am a woman, multiple that is quite privileged. I was fortunate enough to have access to treatment, even though it was not ideal. I was fortunate enough to be able to pay for my treatment. I am a white woman, I am university educated, and I have the ability to advocate for myself. So I know that a lot of people don't have that privilege, and so I just wanted to preface that part of the conversation with acknowledging that for myself. So in the eating disorder treatment that I was in, I was at a public day program, and it was a group program that ran kind of 4 days a week, and there was a period where I was kind of in and out of that day program over kind of a couple of year period. And I guess the last the last admission to that day program was probably the admission where I was at my largest in terms of my body size. And I distinctly remember that on weigh-in days, which I'm not even going to get into that, that's a whole different story, but on weigh-in days we were given a hospital issued, you know, supposedly one size fits all gown to strip down to and put this gown on to be weighed, and it barely even covered me. Like my back was hanging out, my butt was hanging out. Like I was so exposed and so just humiliated and dehumanized. And like I mean, it's common decency, but like even then it just was something that was never thought of. Another example too, because my weight had trended upwards whilst I was in recovery. I mean, funny that. I was given an apple at morning tea time, an apple in a glass of water, as opposed to the snacks that people in smaller bodies and straight-sized bodies were given. And when I tried to challenge this, and when I tried to, like, I was hysterical going into a meeting with one of the dietitians. When I tried to challenge this, I was just immediately shut down. I was told, like, not to be silly, that my weight was trending upwards, so, you know, this was my snack, and basically like put up and shut up essentially. So like those two examples that I can think of are just they're not uncommon, and they're not just isolated incidents. They're situations that are happening to everybody, and they're situations where you're in a position where you're really, really vulnerable, and you're in a position where you're supposed to be receiving help from people who are quote unquote experts in the field. But you know, it's subpar and it's harmful, and when you try to challenge that, you're just getting nowhere.
No,
go on.
If you think about ways in which people can improve their health and their well-being, both emotional and physical, you want them to feel comfortable and safe and supported. And we know that restriction leads to binging, which it just boggles the mind that you can be in a hospital or a medical setting and be experiencing this treatment, which is so far against logic and just ethics, really. That's I mean, and you know, prime examples of fat phobia.
Yeah, totally. And I think because I mean, eating disorder treatment, from my perspective and my thoughts on it anyway, can be quite top down, and this idea that, you know, CBT, for instance, is the gold standard, but you can't thought challenge your way out of systemic oppression. You can't behavioural experiment your way out of, you know, fat phobia that you're experiencing on a daily basis. Like, CBT or those top-down interventions have their place, certainly, and can be very, very effective, certainly, but they don't really, in my opinion, they don't really kind of get to the core. And I think that's what was really missing for me in my treatment. There was nothing that really acknowledged the systemic and the structural, the systemic and the structural harm that was you know, occurring.
Yeah, and as you've mentioned in the past, you can't look at people in a vacuum and what people are experiencing in a vacuum. We do need to take into consideration the systemic and societal expectations and pressures and phobias that are around us and that have led to where we're at currently.
Absolutely.
And that is why it's so important to challenge it, and without putting the onus on the person who is currently experiencing fat phobia in their everyday life or in the medical setting. This is why it's really important for people like me who work in the health profession and who aren't currently experiencing rampant fat phobia to speak up and make sure that we hear the voices of lived experience and learn from you and do what we can to change things at a bigger level.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you've really touched on it in saying that, it's not the responsibility of the people that are experiencing fat phobia. And I think that there's given everything that we've talked about in terms of, the overarching societal preference for thin bodies, the institutional, structural, systemic, structures that show up in our lives. There's this propensity to move towards, the solution to fat phobia being that fat people have the responsibility of changing their bodies in order to not experience fat phobia. There's this very kind of individualistic approach to really dismantling like weight stigma and fat phobia. And I mean, I can see where people are coming from, but it just doesn't solve the issue. Like, you can't have however many million people trying to shrink their bodies, which we know doesn't work in the long term. And, where does that leave us? Because we still have the structures and the pillars in our society that are just upholding these really awful beliefs about people in bigger bodies. So whilst, we can't do the work on the ground without dismantling the structures that uphold those beliefs. So that's why it's everybody's business to challenge fat phobia.
Yeah, and that leads me very nicely to my next point. What can EDQ as a health organisation or a health service and other similar services, what can we do to challenge fat phobia?
One of my biggest things when I talk to people all the time about fat phobia is listen to people who have actually experienced it. Learn from lived experience. And I know that seems so obvious, but there's such a trend that I see in so many spaces where people are pulling in, quote unquote eating disorder experts to talk on fat phobia, and they're in straight size bodies. And it's like, it's such a hard thing for me to see. And I feel this like resentment towards people, who are being asked to step up and talk on these topics, because, they don't really have any idea what that's like on a personal level. So my biggest thing is to learn from people with lived experience. Have these conversations like we're having today. Learning and paying fat people for their courses, for their education, for their time, etc. There's so many wonderful things out there that have been put out by fat people. Promoting that, and it's promoting that, etc. I think EDQ does such an amazing job on social media in terms of the content that you put out there, and really opening up that conversation to some of the really difficult things. And I think there's been there's been a time where eating disorder organisations perhaps weren't as open about talking about fat phobia, because where do you start? And how do you introduce that into an eating disorder organisation in, the safest way possible? But given the fact that fat phobia is such a huge part of eating disorder treatment and recovery, it's a conversation that really needs to happen. So I think continuing to do the work that you do on social media, the brilliant work that I know that you all do with all of your clients and the people who attend EDQ, when you're out at seminars and meetings, not so much these days, but, when you're out and about at seminars and meetings and, chatting to people in the field, talking about fat phobia as, a number one issue in the eating disorder field,
Mm-hmm.
Really opening up those conversations with other people as well.
Yeah. Well, it's good to hear we're on track. And then I suppose the other aspect of it is, how can individuals who are watching maybe challenge fat phobia? I know that you're very good at it. All of us at EDQ do what we can. What about people who don't have as much experience? Because it can be quite intimidating to speak up. I think there's a real fear that by pushing back on some of these things, you might invite them into your life. You might invite people that, trailed off there, sorry. But yeah, that's what individuals do.
Look, and I think we kind of touched on it a little bit before, that sometimes, you know, and you definitely said then that sometimes it can be quite intimidating. It can feel really anxiety provoking in just going out there and like full on challenging fat phobia. But I guess as a starting point, if you don't know a lot about fat phobia, do some reading, follow people on Instagram who are talking about it. You know, look at the people that I follow on Instagram, look at the people that EDQ follows on Instagram, seek out those people who are actually having these conversations, you know, online in a way that, you know, I mean, as I said before, I'm quite direct, but there are certainly people out there whose content isn't so direct, but still have, you know, quite informative and really great content to put out there. So that's a starting point to kind of gain more confidence in being able to speak up. It might be, you know, next time you go to your doctor's office, for instance, and you realise that there's, you know, New Idea or Collagen or whatever the magazines are, you know, sitting on the table that are full of fat phobic content. It might be, you know, just a suggestion to the receptionist that they might want to get, I don't know, like gardening magazines or something in there to replace the, you know, the magazines that are full of diet culture. It might be that you notice next time you walk into a seminar, for instance, that you know, all the chairs have arms, and it might just be a quiet word to the facilitators at the end, you know, to say, hey, have you considered? You know, these are the kind of little things that you can do that might not bring up so much anxiety by confronting it head on. Yeah,
and things like, if someone's commenting on their food choices at lunch in a really negative way, you can say, hey, we don't need to talk about it like that, or I'm not comfortable with that. Would you mind keeping that to yourself for lunch, during this lunch? And that's fine. You don't have to have a big plan. You don't have to be tackling things at the ideological level. You can just be having little one-on-one conversations with people you're already really close to who won't hold anything against you.
Yeah. And I think something that just popped into my head as well, but a question that is really great to ask yourself too, and you might want to do like some journaling, or, you know, might want to kind of write in a notebook about this, but like, what is my relationship with the word fat? What did I believe about fat bodies growing up? You know, what do I believe about fat bodies now? And it's okay to write down whatever you believe, but this is a step towards being able to challenge some of those beliefs that might come out of that reflection.
Yeah, that's a great one. And I think it is really important that we all do individually do that work at some point and keep revisiting it. Yeah. Where was I? Where am I? Where do I want to be at some point? And how can I get there? Yeah. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So if anyone has any questions, we can try to answer them. But I wanted to check in, Nic, do you have any resources at the top of your head that people might like to look up? We can also share them later on, because I know that I personally can't think of a single thing off the top of my head, but I'll be able to make a very long list later.
I guess the ones that kind of come to mind are, I've got a YouTube channel, so that's a source of information there. I would also suggest following Ashley Bennett, who's the body image therapist, Danny Galvin, who is I Am Danny Adriana, Body Liberation with Lindley, who is Lindley Ashline from the States. Reagan Chastain has some amazing resources as well. She's put together some great little resources to take to your doctor's office. So I think there's like a little postcard size that has, you know, bits and pieces on there of, you know, I like to look at my health from a health at every size perspective. Here are some tips. And so that's a card that you can hand to your doctor or your medical professional that is easily accessible, and that can open up a conversation if you're kind of feeling like you're not able to do that for yourself. I guess a book that I really enjoyed, I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to academic stuff, but a book that I really enjoyed that gives a really great history of fat activism is called Fat Activism by Charlotte Cooper. It's a real academic read, I'm not going to lie, but if you're into that sort of thing, then yeah, go for it.
Yeah, great, thank you. Someone's also pointed out that there's a book called Fat Shame, which is great. And yeah, there are a lot of really good books on the topic, and there's a lot. I mean, I think we're living in a really convenient age for gathering this kind of information and being able to access it. There's so many Instagram accounts which are just amazing. Yep. And EDQ will share posts from them from time to time, so that's always a good way to find people to follow. YouTube as well. Yeah, so lots of resources out there, and we'll try and pop a few up over the next few days that people can look into if they like. Yeah. Is there anything else that I've skipped over or that we haven't come back to, or you would like to talk about a little bit further in the last few minutes, Nic?
I don't think so. I think I'd be really interested to hear from people if they want to ask me any other questions or anything like that. I'm happy to spend a few minutes answering any questions. Yeah, I feel like we've covered a lot in a short amount of time.
Yes. Real Fat Phobia 101. How to challenge, when to challenge, who has to challenge, what can we do? Real whirlwind.
I'm glad we're saving this video so people can go back and save this at the beginning.
Oh, this is a good one. How does one challenge family members that are fat phobic without destroying those relationships?
Look, that's such a tough one, isn't it? Because the relationship that we have with our family, yeah, it really kind of comes back to how ingrained those beliefs have been over time. I think as a starting point, you can sort of, like, if that kind of talk is happening over dinner or over lunch or whatever it is, as a starting point, you could perhaps say something like, you know, talking about food in this way doesn't actually really help me. Can we talk about something else instead? Or, you know, I'm not really prepared to talk about that right now. How about we change the subject? So you're not really attacking the person, and you're not really kind of challenging them head on. You're just saying, you know, look, that's not really helpful for me right now. Can we perhaps talk about something else?
Yeah, so it's more about a boundary than a challenge, which in the moment is still really difficult, but it is a little bit easier, I think.
Yeah.
And you can do it in a really gentle or jokey way as well, like, this isn't making my food taste any better. Let's talk about something more fun. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, even at dinner time, being able to kind of in control of that instance by saying, you know, so how was everyone's day? Or, you know, whatever the situation might be.
But I admit it's really difficult, particularly with family who may still really hold on to a lot of that internalized fat phobia and that haven't worked through it. You know, I kind of question, like, if somebody says that, yes, they've worked all the way through their fat phobia, I'm like, are you sure? So, yeah, look, we all hold on to internalized fat phobia, so it's any wonder that, you know, it pops up in our families.
Yeah, thank you. I've got 2 more questions. Someone would like to know, after the fat phobic experiences you had during your treatment, what ended up turning things around, or how did you reach recovery, if you're comfortable with sharing that?
Yeah, sure. I actually fired my therapist, my doctor at the time, and left the day program because it wasn't doing my mental health any good at all. I just wasn't happy. And I realized that a lot of what I was experiencing both at the day program and in my therapy and, you know, from my doctor was a lot of gaslighting and a lot of fat phobia that was really left unchecked. So I made the decision not to work with them anymore, and left. It was a decision that I didn't make lightly. I thought about the potential consequences of that, but I decided to give it a go for my own recovery and, you know, my own mental health and my own sanity. Yeah, that was kind of a huge step, and also that accompanied with finding my voice and finding a platform where I could share my experience with people who have experienced similar things. And so finding a sense of community where I didn't feel so alone and where other people don't feel so alone, and that was really important as well. I guess I started to do a lot of work on unpacking my own fat phobia, and I did that on my own. I don't really know how I did it, but I ended up doing it. I think, yeah, and I guess that's one thing that I wanted to say. Like, if you're working with a professional who is not ideal and is perpetuating a lot of fat phobia and that's not respecting your boundaries, it's really okay for you to look for somebody else, to look for somebody who is going to give you the respectful treatment that you deserve.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And that, you did mention finding a platform and finding a community, which brings us to our next question, which is, how or where can we share our experiences of fat phobia if we don't have a platform for it?
That's a really tough one. I've found that social media is a platform. Is it the most ideal platform? I don't know. There's a lot of variables in there with social media, and you kind of put yourself out there and you run the risk of that sometimes. I don't think that there's necessarily I don't think that there's necessarily a platform. I'm just trying to think, but yeah, look, social media is one. If you can find, I don't know where you are, but if you can find support groups that are aligned with a fat positive perspective, certainly that's a platform where you could share your experience of fat phobia, so long as that group was aligned with fat positive values. But yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, go on.
I think also just speaking with your friends and family in your workplace, it is incredible the amount of difference you can make for people just by speaking up within your immediate circle. Yeah. I know that from my own experience, I've been vocal about lunchroom environments and people's chit-chat in there. And from me speaking about that with my friends for a few times, they realised that they also could speak up in their lunchrooms, and it just keeps rippling out from there. So I wouldn't underestimate the value of just speaking in person with people you already know. It really, often it's just one person having the confidence and valuing this decision to challenge fat phobia enough that will give other people the realization that they can also do it.
Yeah, that's such a lovely summary. I think that comes back to what we were saying around it's everybody's responsibility, and the more that we empower people with the language and the vocabulary and the support and community to be able to do that for themselves, the more of a trickle effect it has, as you so beautifully highlighted with that example.
Thank you. And someone else has very kindly pointed out that there are, of course, medical professionals who aren't fat phobic and who are actively working to challenge it, which we didn't say, but we should have. It's definitely true.
Absolutely.
There's so many out there, and I think more and more people are moving into this area every day, which is amazing. It's what we all want.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Nic. So we're coming up to the end. I don't want us to get cut off, so I did want to say thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure working with you, and this conversation has been really great, and I hope really valuable for everyone watching. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to work with you and connect.
Yeah. Alrighty. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We'll post this online, and yeah, feel free to send us or Nic a message if there's anything you want to follow up or say from today.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.